Hello and welcome to a new episode of Her Voice. If you were to ask an average Westerner about the status of women in Saudi Arabia, the most likely answer would be the veil, strict gender segregation, and the ban on women driving. Saudi women have fallen victim to this negative portrayal by the Western media, and any woman wearing a veil has now become the symbol of women in the Arab world. In today's show, we will be taking a closer look at women's rights in the Middle East with a particular emphasis on Saudi Arabia. We will be talking to a panel of experts about the evolution of women's rights in the MENA region, while Saudi women are still fighting for their least basic rights of leading a normal life. But first, let's watch this brief report about the current situation of women's rights in the MENA region.
After playing a major role in the Arab Spring and other regional reform movements, women are still fighting to ensure their rights and improve their social, political and economic status in the Middle East and North Africa. As countries across the region rebuild themselves, many women have found their expectations unfulfilled, and they fear that the newly formed governments will fail to address or will limit women's rights. According to the Fair Observer, female political participation has improved in some countries, but many women insist that their political and economic status has remained unchanged or have worsened. Female parliamentary candidates have participated in the region's post-uprising elections with mixed success. Women won an unprecedented 32% of parliamentary seats in Algeria, 23% in Tunisia, 17% in Libya. However, in Egypt, women constituted only 1% of the country's parliament, which was disbanded in June 2012. Women's rights groups are now calling for a boycott of the upcoming legislative elections. In Yemen, only one woman holds a seat in the 301-member parliament. For some women's rights groups, more concerning is the lack of women in powerful decision-making positions. In Egypt, Tunisia and Libya, only 2 women have been appointed to each country's cabinet and 3 women to Yemen's. In addition to women's political standing, concerns remain about their economic and social status. Female workforce participation in the Middle East and North Africa region remains the lowest in the world. In Yemen, 4 out of 5 women in a 2012 Oxfam survey indicated that their circumstances had worsened since the revolution. And despite the bleak outlook, many women are continuing to fight for their rights by campaigning, protesting, reporting, and forming rights groups. Even in countries that have not experienced revolutions, women are speaking out, including in Saudi Arabia, where women defied the driving ban last year, and Iran, where women have joined protests against the regime in 2009. It seems that the region-wide climate of change and reform has given the women's rights movement renewed energy.
Now, to give us a more detailed picture of the current status of women in the Middle East, I have with me in the studio Nawal al-maghafi, a journalist and filmmaker, and Nisreen Salem, feminist and author. Welcome to the show, ladies, and thank you for joining us. First of all, Nawal, do women in the MENA region have any rights in your opinion?
I think there's a difficulty when it comes to women's rights all over the world, not just the MENA region. But when we talk about the Middle East, it really depends on where you're looking at. I would say that women in the Gulf, for example, are very behind when it comes to women's rights. If anything, to a certain extent, we're going behind in women's rights other than moving forward. Yes. But when you look at the Levant, for example, like Lebanon and in Jordan, for example, there seems to be major progress and steps going forward when it comes to women's rights. But the main aspect in it is basically education. When you see the countries in the Middle East where there's a lot of financing and there's a lot of attention going into education, then women's rights is developing. But in the regions where education is lacking or there isn't much attention going into education, that's where we see that women are very oppressed.
Right, okay. So if we talked about the places like countries like Jordan and Lebanon and even Syria before, what's happened to it? In the 1950s and the 1960s, women began to make slow but steady strides in parts of the Arab world like Syria, Egypt and Lebanon. But even parts of the conservative Gulf regions began began more recently to follow suit. And across the region, more women are working. But because of the Arab Spring, this has actually overturned things. And now we believe, or we seem to be living the more of the Stone Age lifestyle rather than the more sort of advanced lifestyle. What do you think of that, Nasreen?
I think that the conflicts that have arisen from the revolutions, whether in Egypt or Syria or even Tunisia, it has created a space, the public space has become more of a concern. So it's about dominating the public space, and of course it's about dominating women's activities in that public space.
Right.
So there is more focus now, or more targeting of female activity when it comes to women walking down the street, women going out to work, and so on. It's almost like they're trying to limit the women's roles in order to dominate, once again, that public sphere. And that's where we're seeing backwardness in terms of women's rights. The basic right of just walking down the street and not being harassed is becoming a concern in large areas in the Middle East.
Right.
I think also with the Arab Spring, we saw sort of vacuum of power after we removed these dictators, and we have a lot of groups or want-to-be leaders, if you can say that, wanting to take over power in these countries. And what stronger weapon to use than to use religion to take that? And that's what's happened in the countries after the Middle East, that we've seen groups like the Muslim Brotherhood wanting to take over power, or whether it's terrorist groups trying to take over power. And they're using religion, which is something that no one can question. It's a bit like what Saudi Arabia does. They use religion with the nation. And that's something that the people can't question when the law is based on Sharia or based on religion. And that's why we see this more conservative kind of theme going back into these countries, I think.
I see. But wouldn't one argue that women in the Middle East are similar to the women in the West, as historically women in the West were not treated equally anyway?
Yes, and just like we can say that the Arab Spring is a bit like the French Revolution. We seem to be behind, but we seem to be following the steps of the Western countries. And so maybe we could say, if we are following the steps of the Western countries, that maybe in a couple of years' time we will end up having as much rights as women here in the West. But I mean, even in the West, women face a lot of problems, and there's still discrimination between male and female. And although they have rights, I do still think there's some kind of discrimination between male and females in the West.
It still exists, obviously, quite often in places of work, and sort of amongst even sort of friends and sort of their little communities.
But there's also another factor that plays in the Middle East when it comes to fighting for women's rights, is that the more you talk about them in the Middle East, the more they say, well, we don't want that Western way of life, we don't want to become westernized. It's almost as if they look at feminism or just women's rights as a Western intrude, like a colonialist power. And in order to like a self-defense mechanism is to resist those movements, those steps forward and progress. So in a way, we are stopping our own selves from moving forward under the name of we don't want to be westernized.
But as a feminist, Nasreen, what's your views of how some Middle Eastern countries, especially like Saudi Arabia, where they view women's rights to democracy as a Western concept rather than anything?
Well, I think it's very hypocritical, given that it's okay for the men to follow westernized ways of life, whether it's buying the latest car or wearing the trendiest suit. But the buck stops when it comes to women's rights. If a woman who wants to drive is basically adopting a Western way of life, and therefore it's against Islam and against the traditional way of living. And in order to protect Islam, that's the way they see it, is to stop this from happening. To me, it's the biggest paradox ever.
Yes. What about you, Noel? What's your
I mean, I found what you said really interesting about women, being afraid of being westernized. And that is true. But then I feel like a woman's right, if it's there, if you have the right to, for example, go out to work, or if you have the right to drive, then fine, it's your own choice whether you do it or not. If you think that's Western and you don't want to do it, then fine, don't. But at least you have the right to do it, and it is available to you. But the problem in the Middle East is, especially in Saudi Arabia, is that they don't even have the option to do that. So you're kind of, you know, you're chaining them, and that's how they're being deprived of their basic rights.
Exactly.
But the women who are afraid or believe this is Western, or, you know, then it's kind of their own problem that they're...
Exactly, and that's why the fight needs to be for civil rights. It's
Yeah.
not just about women's rights, it's civil rights, just the fundamental human rights, if you like. The right to say yes or no, to be given that choice, which is a very basic choice, and then they can choose whether they want to follow suit or they would rather keep their own way of living.
Exactly.
Well, as a filmmaker and a journalist, Noel, you've reported from places where sort of mainstream media has ignored during the Arab Spring, and you entered uncharted territories that no woman would dare go. How did you manage that?
Actually, being a woman really worked in my favor, because
Really?
men in the Middle East think that women are harmless and there's no way she's going to do any serious journalism. Oh, she's just a woman, she'll be fine. So it really worked in my favor. I mean, when I went, for example, to Sada, which is now, you know, in the latest
Yes.
headlines because of the Houthis, I went and I wore the veil, and I was the only journalist that was ever able to enter because I was covered up, and they just thought I was another woman from the village. Now, if I was a man, then I would have been stopped at every checkpoint. I would have been searched. They would have taken me out of the car and searched the car in case of weapons or whatever. And so I probably would have never made it there. The same goes for when I do my interviews in the Middle East. Men are so, you know, they truly believe that no woman in the Middle East could be a proper journalist, one that could be a threat to them, like a man would. And so they always give me interviews. They're always very happy for us to come into their homes and to film. And, you know, a couple of my documentaries are observational documentaries where I've had to live in people's homes for a really long time. And, you know, with the Middle Eastern culture, it's really difficult to have a man stay in your home, you know, especially if you have your wife and your daughters. And I've been really lucky to be a woman, because I've been able to go in and completely blend in with the families. They let me, you know, they give me access to all areas because I'm a woman. So it's worked in my favor. But then at the same time, there's a limit to how much work I can do. For example, like, I come from a very conservative, traditional family, and such things like going on TV without a headscarf was such a taboo at first, and it was really difficult for them to comprehend, because my family back home in Yemen would get really annoyed, or they'd find it as something shameful that, you know, one of their daughters is growing up without a headscarf. So there's some things that have been difficult, but I've always believed that my parents wouldn't have given me the education I have if it wasn't for this, and I've always fought for the things that I wanted, and they've always been very supportive. So, but in other aspects, when it comes to you know, investigations and documentaries, and it's actually been really, you know, helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. Well, in Saudi Arabia has an abysmal human rights record, particularly with regards to protecting women. Although in recent years, the rights of women have been incriminately extended, like being allowed to vote in local elections, for example, their actions are still severely restricted. The country's religious police, who work for the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, ensure that women act in accordance with Islamic law. In a country where a woman cannot even open a bank account without her husband's permission, here are several other things women in the conservative Muslim kingdom are still unable to do. Let's watch this brief report.
Have you ever wondered what it's like for a woman to live in Saudi Arabia? Here's a list of the 12 things a woman in Saudi Arabia cannot do according to theweek.co.uk. First, women cannot go anywhere without a chaperone. Saudi women need to be accompanied by a male guardian known as a mahram whenever they leave the house. The guardian is often a male relative and will accompany women on all their errands, including shopping trips and visits to the doctor. Second, the issue of a driving ban in Saudi Arabia has attracted both local and global mainstream media as well as human rights organizations for a long period of time, resulting in a huge pressure on Saudi authorities to amend the law and allow women to drive. There is no official law that bans women from driving, but deeply held religious belief prohibits it, with Saudi clerics arguing that female drivers, quote, undermine social values. Third, vote in elections. Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world, apart from the Vatican City, where women are not allowed to vote. However, women will be allowed to cast their ballot in local elections soon. And fourth, wear clothes or makeup that show off their beauty. The dress code for women is governed by a strict interpretation of Islamic law and is enforced to varying degrees across the country. The majority of women are forced to wear an abaya, a long black cloak, and a headscarf. The face does not necessarily need to be covered, but this does not stop the religious police from harassing women for exposing too much flesh or wearing too much makeup. Number 5. Interacting with men. Women are required to limit the amount of time spent with men they are not related to. The majority of public buildings, including offices, banks and universities, have separate entrances for men and women. The Daily Telegraph here in London reports public transportation, parks, beaches and amusement parks are also segregated in most parts of the country. Number 6. Go for a swim, totally forbidden. Number 7. Compete freely in sports. When Saudi Arabia sent its female athletes to the London Games for the first time, hardline clerics denounced the women as prostitutes. While they were allowed to compete, they had to be accompanied by a male guardian and wear a Sharia-compliant sports kit that covered their hair. And number 8. Try on clothes when shopping, and often more unusual restrictions include entering a cemetery, reading an uncensored fashion magazine, or buying a Barbie.
12 things that we managed to list that Saudi women cannot do included the ban from driving that caused a lot of controversy around the world. A Saudi Arabian historian tried to justify the nation's ban on female drivers by saying that women who drive in other countries, such as the United States, don't care if they're raped, and that sexual violence is no big deal to them. He claims that women can be raped when a car breaks down, but unlike other countries, Saudi Arabia protects its women from the risk by not allowing them to drive in the first place. What do you think of this justification, ladies?
I think it's absolutely ridiculous.
I think it's insulting to men more so than it is to women, because it implies that men cannot control themselves if they see a woman behind a wheel who's, a damsel in distress. The last thing a damsel in distress would expect is to be raped. But it's also very insulting because it is part of the whole propaganda against allowing women to drive. It's what they're feeding the Saudi public, that women driving is basically a Western phenomena, and Western women are okay with getting raped on a regular basis, apparently, and again, it's a drive against the Western ways of living and trying to protect their own ways of doing things in their own country or in their community, and it is very ill-founded, and it's surprising that people buy into that, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. But it's also that driving is kind of like a type of freedom. Absolutely. Being able to drive, you can go wherever you want to go. It's such a big slice of freedom in the Middle East, especially in a place where if you don't know how to drive, you can't get anywhere without a male guy taking you to places, because there is no public transport. There's, you're not even allowed to, I think, to go on a cab in Saudi Arabia without a male escort. So they're just depriving all these women of freedom because they're so afraid to give women freedom in Saudi Arabia.
And it's more than freedom, it's independence.
Yeah,
an independent woman is a very scary creature in the Middle East, isn't she? But situations like, for example, a widower or a divorcee who's got children and she lives alone for whatever reason in Saudi Arabia, she literally is a prisoner in her own home. She cannot access even just regular services like the grocery shop and so on without having to have a male chaperone, and that's not always available.
That's right, yes.
And making them so dependent on a male chaperone in their life, it's very dangerous.
Yes, I mean, would you define the sort of justification as oppression? And do you think oppression is oppression something that is so embedded in the culture that the person being oppressed cannot recognize it?
It's certainly oppression, it's subjugation, it's control. It's very much manipulating the space the woman is allowed to occupy and making sure that it's minimal so that she doesn't have an effect on the rest of society, because for whatever justifications, but it's limiting her and downsizing her as much as possible.
And it doesn't just stop there. It's not just about driving in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I went to Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago to film a film, and I went by myself. And I always thought, like, everyone told me you're going to find it so hard to work in Saudi Arabia. And I thought, like, I come from Yemen. How bad could it be? But actually, it's a whole different world for women in Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely.
Like in Yemen, you have the rights. You can do whatever you want. You could go out in, you know, in shorts if you wanted to. There's no law banning you from do that, but women choose not to do that because of cultural and religious values. Yeah. But in Saudi Arabia, a woman is like a foreign creature when she's walking around the streets on her own. You know, they have no independent. They just don't understand how a woman can be independent. They're actually surprised when a woman goes into a store and they can hear her voice because she always has a male chaperone. It's always the man that's doing all the talking, and it's really, really a difficult country for a woman to work in.
To live in and maybe grow up in as well.
Yeah.
If you're a child and you take your child there to live there, it's going to be a complete environment, really
it is, but
weird one.
It's the making of a woman into a taboo.
Yeah.
She's basically a walking, talking taboo, a living, breathing taboo.
Yeah.
That's right.
And,
Well, actually, after a campaign for change that was that gathered pace on social media by some female activists, numerous women filmed themselves actually behind the wheel back in October 26. That was last year, I believe. And they were actually driving their cars, and then they uploaded these videos on YouTube to show everyone that they are actually driving their cars and they're carefree. Two were actually taken to court, and I'm sure you've heard this in your news, and imprisoned, and then later they were released. Isn't this a larger system of customs and laws that makes women heavily reliant on men for their basic day-to-day survival? Because that's exactly what you've just said now. It's them sort of just relying on the men, on the male, you know, day in, day out. But isn't that just become a custom now, and that's it, they don't care anymore?
I feel like some women in the Middle East, to a certain extent, get so used to it that they don't know how to operate without a man.
Yeah, if they move place, like if they move country, for example.
Yeah.
Say, for example, somebody being sort of living on their lives in Saudi Arabia or anywhere in the Gulf, you know, you've got the maids, you've got the chauffeur, you've got et cetera, and then you come and live out here. It's going to be a disaster. It's just going to be like, how am I going to cope? How am I going to go out on the streets? How am I going to drive, you know?
well, I have to say, having lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years, in various parts of Saudi Arabia, I have to say that Saudi women are among the fiercest women I have known.
Really?
Ever. They are amazing.
Yeah.
They are amazing. You know, they are fighters. It's not, and a lot of the time, yes, they have accepted it as a living situation. However, I don't think they respect it as much, and they do resent it. But do they have another way of doing things? No, they don't. And a lot of them opt for traveling abroad or living abroad. There are many Saudi women who have made it outside of Saudi Arabia. You know, you go to the States, you come to England. You know, they are paving their own way outside of the country, which is a shame, because why can't they do the same inside the country?
Countries. That's right.
The country is essentially depriving itself of its most precious resources, its own people.
That's right, yes. Well, actually, with me on Skype in Cairo is Mr. Hugh Miles. He's an award-winning author and journalist. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us, Hugh.
Thank you.
How do you see the present status of Arab women in the Middle East, and do they have similar rights and opportunities, just like their Western counterparts, do you think?
No, they certainly don't have opportunities or rights like their Western counterparts. They are a much abused part of society. Of course, their rights are very limited, and this is a major problem for Arab societies, and it's one of the main reasons why they have failed to progress in the normal way.
Right, okay. Because what happened was, at the start of the show, we said that if you were to ask an average Westerner about the status of women in, say, places like Saudi Arabia, the most likely answer would be the veil, the strict gender segregation, and the ban on women driving. Who do you blame for this stereotyping, and why?
Well, I think you have to understand that Arab societies and societies like Saudi Arabia are extremely conservative societies, and they have been impacted by modern life pretty recently, and this has had a radical, revolutionary effect on the people living there, suddenly to be exposed to the modern media and to travel and to be educated abroad. So it's naturally it's a traumatic shock for these societies to encounter Western values in this way. So it's it's understandable that there's extreme reactions.
Right, so it is understandable and justifiable. A headline in the Mail Online captured my attention back in May. The Orthodox Jewish sect was compared to Saudi Arabia after banning women in London from driving and even barring sort of pupils from school if they are dropped off by mothers. Community rabbis have also agreed that children dropped off in cars for school by their mothers should be turned away because women drivers break, and I quote, the traditional rules of modesty in our camp. Now, rabbis are also backing the ban, and one said it's always been regarded as not the done thing for a lady to drive. Are we seeing the Saudi ways of life making its way into communities here in London?
Well, I think we are, and unfortunately, the price of liberty and emancipation and human rights is constant vigilance, and we need to keep having this argument for women's rights. And unfortunately, even in Europe, we need to have this argument, which we thought we won many years ago, but we need to have it again now, because there are religious groups like the Wahhabi Saudi-style Muslims and conservative Jews who have quite different ideas. So, yes, I mean, the Saudis are not unique in their view of women. I mean, the situation in Saudi Arabia is, as I say, been particularly traumatic because of what a conservative country it was. And also, the regime has propagated this prejudice against women because the regime needs to pander to the conservatives in the country in order to maintain power. And part of that means that the conservative clerics and the religious establishment has control over society. And so this is really a sop to the conservatives, and the solution to this, of course, is to have a democratic debate in Saudi Arabia where everyone joins in, including women, to talk about what's right and what the laws should be and who should drive. But unfortunately, there's no chance of that because, of course, there's no freedom of association or freedom of expression.
Right, I see. What do you think about that, ladies? What's your view with what you said about democratic sort of setting with ladies being involved? What do you think?
Well, my thoughts are the idea of women and their rights in places like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East in general, and trying to emancipate them and give them more rights. I don't necessarily think that they are Western values as such. If you go back in history, 11th century Islamic history, if you like, in Andalusia, Moorish Spain at the time, women were very much in the public space. A poet like Walada bint al-Mustakafi, she was out there very fiercely. She used to be clad in almost nothing. She used to wear very see-through clothes with her poetry written on it. And nobody bothered her. And even when you go back to the early Islamic years, when Islam first came, and women were working, they were out there, they were buying, they were selling, they were looking after their homes just the same.
They were fighting as well,
Exactly, absolutely. They were recruiting soldiers. And
even the Prophet's wife used to work.
Yes, and he took over her business after he married her, basically. So I don't know if it's wrong to look at these values as Western values, because then that makes our communities, the Middle Eastern communities, very defensive and think that it's an encroachment on their Islamic way of living. The idea is actually to remind them that the Islamic way of living is far more liberal than you make it out to be. And the basis that you are basing all this on, which is supposedly Islam and Sharia law, it has no foundation there whatsoever. And that should be the argument and that should be the fight. And yes, modernity has been a shock and it has been quite traumatic, and a lot of places in the Middle East have still not even entered that phase of shock yet, because that's how isolated they are. And there needs to be a lot of preparation for them in order for them to catch up with the rest of the world. And I think that's the problem in the Middle East right now, the clash of modernity with what is becoming a very extreme way of seeing Islamic law, You know, it's not even Islamic law, it's what they interpret it to be Islamic
And it goes
law.
back to the point of education.
Yeah.
It's because people, you know, believe in whatever anyone tells them Islam is, or what Islam is to be, and because they're not educated enough to understand what Islam used to be, they don't read into history, they don't investigate it for themselves, that this happens. You know, they have these sheikhs that come up with fatwas, fatwa after fatwa that they make up
endless.
themselves. It's endless. Yeah, exactly. And this is the problem we're facing. If they were educated enough to read up and to analyze these things on their own, then maybe we wouldn't be where we are today.
That's right, yeah, that's right. Hugh, having lived in Egypt for a while, do you believe that some Western accusations against Islamic treatment of women, such as the lack of personal freedom to choose careers, living an oppressed life, or being banned from driving, just like in Saudi Arabia, are justified?
Well, Médecins Sans Frontières recently said that 90% of women in Egypt have experienced FGM. Now, obviously that's not exactly Islamic, although it's pretty muddled up with Islamic culture. So I think there's little doubt that the women in Egypt have suffered and continue to suffer huge repression and suffering because of things done against them in the name of Islam. And I think it's important to say that, you know, what is done in the name of Islam is not necessarily Islamic. This is just the state's interpretation of Islam. So in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, you know, they have their own version of Islam. But, you know, as your guest was saying, men and women have equal rights to interpret the Islamic teachings. And, you know, I think there needs to be an open discussion about Islam and women's rights. And this is not, it doesn't need to be contaminated with Western ideas of human rights even.
And in your opinion, can you be a Muslim and a feminist? Or is that a contradiction in terms?
No, I don't think it is. I think you know, it depends on your interpretation of the Quran. I think that you can interpret it in a very liberal way.
Right. What do you think as a feminist, Nisreen? Can you be a Muslim and a feminist?
I think, yes, of course you can. You can be anything and a feminist as long as you believe that as a woman you are not a second-class citizen and that you are entitled to equal rights, just as any man, any human being. That no one should be dictating to you how you should live your life. And there's nothing wrong with being a Muslim and a feminist. In fact, we need more of those because we do need to have that discussion. As he said, we need to have an open discussion, an open debate about what rights do women actually have in Islam and what are the interpretations that are on the table, and we need to contest those interpretations so that we as a society can be more in harmony with modernity, so that the ills that are coming out at the moment can be suppressed somehow, or at least controlled and hopefully put in their place.
Yes. Well, Hugh Miles, award-winning author and journalist, thank you very much for taking part in Her Voice today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, to get a feel of what the general public think about banning women from driving, our cameraman and reporter went to the streets of London and asked both men and women whether they are with or against the ban and why. Let's watch this video now.
Well, I'm not surprised because they seem to ban women for most things.
So are you against the ban or with it, and why?
I think it's awful. I mean, people should just live and be able to move around freely.
I think it's normal and they should drive as everyone else. But I think it's complicated in their country, and I don't know if one day they will have the right to do it.
So are you against or with the ban, and why?
I'm against because I think it's very important to have the equality between men and women.
Oh, I like driving for leisure, although it's more for going from just one place to another. And I prefer gear shift drive to automatic. I've done both. I enjoy driving provided there's not too much traffic, which there often is.
That's true. So how do you feel about women both in the Saudi and the Jewish Orthodox community about being banned from driving?
Okay, I was not aware of the Orthodox community, the Jewish Orthodox, but Saudi Arabia was very much aware, and I think it's the most, I mean, I can't use words strong enough to condemn any kind of restriction on an activity of women which men are doing. I see absolutely no reason why a woman should not be allowed to do the same thing that a man is doing.
I think they're being held back. I think it's restricted. It means they're controlled. They haven't got their freedom.
So are you with or against the ban, and why?
Against it, definitely. They should be able to drive, because if a child is sick and they need to go to hospital, they need to rely on a man to take them. It's wrong. If you have a family and that, babies and that, you know, they're ill, you quickly get in a car, take them to the hospital or anything, really.
I think it is an absurd. Yes, I think everybody should have the right to drive or to do other things such as that.
So I suppose you're against it?
I'm against the ban.
And why is that?
Because I think they should have the right. Why not? I don't understand why not.
My first thought is putting myself in their shoes. I can't seem to make sense of why women should be banned. They're still a human being. They still have freedoms, dreams, places to go, things to do. But from my perspective, I really feel that sometimes, as a society, if we kind of lessen some of the restrictions we try to have over others to control, that makes much more sense in a more freer society that be able to convey what they want properly, not feel suppression by one and then you've got the kickback of the other. It doesn't create a uniform society, it just creates more of a divide. So ultimately, I may be skating around the direct answer you're looking for. However, I just feel at the end of the day, strip it all back, step all the way back. What have you got? Another human being who wants to get to the same places that you want to do with the freedom of a car.
I think that all women should be allowed to drive. I think that everyone's equal. I don't think that women shouldn't be allowed to do so. I used to live in Saudi Arabia, and when I lived there, obviously I couldn't drive. I used to have a driver, and it leaves you feeling somewhat, you have no independence. You're dependent on somebody else all the time.
Right, ladies, most of the general public, especially the women that were against the ban and felt very strongly about the right for women to actually drive and lead a normal life. How far are we from separating between culture and religion, do you think?
The problem is, Dina, that there are a lot of women in Saudi Arabia who actually want to uphold the ban. And that's where the real struggle comes from.
Why is that? Why do you think is that?
For various reasons. They do believe that, they genuinely believe that the way their society is run is the true Islamic way of life, and no woman should be without a male chaperone. And you know, it will become more problematic for the girls or the women to go out there in the public space. It's a protectionist way of seeing things. They're trying to protect their women and their girls from immediate danger in the society, from Western values coming into their way of thinking and so on. So it is a very protectionist way of seeing things.
So are we saying that most women, let's say in Saudi Arabia or even in the Middle East, are wanting to be more in control of their personal freedom and basic human rights before they ask to be in control of a vehicle, do you think?
I think, like you said, it's just, you know, it's a fear of modernity. Like you said, what we do need is, going back to what you previously said, is more feminists that are Muslims, more feminists that can say it's okay for you to have your rights and be a good Muslim at the same time. Yeah. There isn't a clash between both, because we're constantly taught by these sheikhs and these fatwas that, you know, if you fight for your women's rights, if you end up driving a car, if you're independent, that this is haram, and this. But no, me being independent, me driving here today, I don't think I've broken a single Islamic rule. You know, I'm a conservative Muslim, and I believe in Islam, and I believe that Islam empowers women, and it protects women, yes, of course, but it empowers women, and it shouldn't be something that sets you back. There's a lot of things that are just said by the sheikhs and the fatwas and that men use to oppress women and to make sure they don't have their independence because they're so afraid of women being independent and being more powerful than them.
Yeah. I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Well, what I've come across last night actually was really funny. I don't know whether you find it funny. Maybe it isn't funny, maybe it is funny, but I thought it was a bit strange. Was a woman-only city, apparently, that is the first woman-only city that is essentially a female-only industrial zone in Hufaf in Saudi Arabia, which is actually going to be built. And it will employ about 5,000 Saudi women. I'm reading the information because I found it last night. It employs 5,000 Saudi women in the textile, pharmaceutical and food processing industries, and special sections production halls will be reserved for women, but it is not intended as a women-only development. It is intended that women will run the companies and factories and live in adjacent neighborhoods to make traveling to work easier. Is that the right way? Or do you think it is right that women are fighting for women-only cities? Do you think that's the right way of trying to solve the women's rights issue? Or?
I think it will exasperate the issue. And it's also, I mean, you've mentioned so few fields. It puts women in a very limited category of labour, which is basically keeping them at working class and stopping them from progressing and moving forward. And let's face it, these companies are not going to run very well without men. Just that, like the industries that are run just by men aren't, they're becoming obsolete. They cannot function alone without women's contributions. There needs to be more trust, I think, and there needs to be, because there's such a focus on women as dangerous creatures. There needs to be a way away from that. Women are not dangerous, and if it's a lack of control on men's behalf, then we need to educate the men so that they can actually know how to deal with women in the working space, because it will come naturally to women, I'm sure. And once people are getting used to that, things become normal, and relation and integration and mixing becomes normal. And actually, it is the normal way of doing things.
Actually, I believe that, this women's only village or whatever city is, when we start doing things to work our way around these major problems in the Middle East, this is more dangerous than women not having any rights at all. Because at least with the women not having rights, they'll continue fighting for their rights until one day, hopefully, they'll get their basic right. But when we start creating things to work our way around it and making it okay.
Okay, yeah, you've got your freedom, but I'm afraid it's going to be only
sort of,
and
then you'll have women that are fighting for their rights, and then they'll have people telling them, well, you can go work in that city over there.
Yes, exactly.
You can go drive around in that little piece of space over there. That's ridiculous. This is more dangerous to our societies.
That's right, yes, unfortunately. Finally, as a filmmaker, Noel, have you ever considered producing a film that would change the stereotypes that are created by mainstream Western media about Arab women?
No, yeah, of course. I wanted to make a film about this other friend of mine she's a humanitarian worker in Yemen, and she works a lot with men, and she finds a lot of difficulties. But most recently, she started this initiative where she actually she takes. This is really gruesome, by the way. She takes, bodies of men that can't find graves. They're like Christians or from other religions, so there's no graveyards for them in Yemen, and she buries them. And that's such a man's kind of
it is a man's job,
thing to do. But no men in Yemen are doing that, and she's doing it, and so she's getting a lot of respect. So I wanted to do something about her and how these women are really fighting for good change in the Middle East, and that they should get the respect and the recognition that they deserve, just as men do.
Of course, of course.
See, there's nothing a woman can't do.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. Well, best of luck with that. And again, keep us updated with it and how it goes. It'll be lovely to actually catch up with you once it's all completed.
Definitely.
Lovely. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our show today. I would really like to thank Noel al-Maghafi, journalist and filmmaker, for being our guest today, and for Nisreen Salem, feminist and author, for taking part in our discussion, and Hugh Miles, journalist and author, for speaking to us from Cairo. So thank you all very, very much for coming.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Women within the Middle East and even Saudi Arabia have full potential to become a serious and powerful force within their society if they fully attach themselves onto the idea of becoming serious actors within any arena. More importantly, once they do this and they impact their role within the family, they will then gradually impact social change within their country. It does not matter where the process starts. Women can become political actors, social actors, or economic actors first and then move into other realms. What is important within this process is the idea that they continue on the path of fighting for their liberation and change, because all three of these spheres are interconnected, and for women to become fully liberated within a society, they have to be able to be fully liberated within all of these spheres. As Elizabeth Cady Stanton rightly said, the best protection any woman can have is courage. Thank you for joining me, and goodbye.